This episode is sponsored by PAX, the gold standard in emergency response bags. So when you're working under pressure, you need kit to be both dependable, tough and intuitive, and that's exactly what you get with PAX. Every bag is handcrafted by expert tailors who understand the demands of personal care, from the high-tech, skin-friendly and environmentally responsible materials to the cutting-edge welding process that reduces seams and makes cleaning easier. PAX absolutely puts performance first. They've partnered with 3M to make perfect reflective surfaces for better visibility, and bright grey interior makes finding kit effortless and fast even in low light. With over 200 designs, PAX bags are made to suit your role, your needs and your environment. And thanks to their modular system, many bags work seamlessly together no matter the setup. PAX doesn't chase trends, their designs stay consistent, so once you know one, you know them all. And if your bag ever takes a beating, their in-house repair team will bring it back to life. PAX are built to perform, made to last. Learn more at pax.bags.com or head to the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. In today's episode, we're going to explore one of the most profound and indeed humbling themes in medicine, that of what dying and indeed those who've been brought back to life can teach us about living. So I'm joined by Dr. Matt Morgan, who's an intensive care consultant, researcher and author of The Second Act, a book inspired by the hundreds of patients really he's met and treated that have crossed the threshold of death and returned. So case studies and indeed patients like Ed, who were struck by lightning, left without a pulse, revived through rapid, decisive pre-hospital action. But these individuals, Matt believes we should really be listening to. So not necessarily the influencers or business gurus, but people who faced the thin margins between life and death and indeed emerged with a new clarity about what truly matters. So in this conversation, we're really going to reflect on the emotional and indeed ethical challenges of working in the fog between life and death. Also the importance of listening to survivors and the critical role of pre-hospital teams and the role they play in offering second chances of life. We're also going to ask how we carry the weight of this work without losing our humanity. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you for a lovely introduction.
I just wondered if we could start and then just dig into really your work over 20 years in that thick fog between life and death as an intensivist. Could I get you to speak to really what you've learned about that space and indeed how it can maybe help us reframe our perspectives on pre-hospital care?
Yeah, I think that's really where this book, A Second Act, and why my interest in following up patients who've survived a cardiac arrest came from. As you say, I've worked as a doctor for 20 years in different sectors, most commonly in the intensive care unit. And, every day I meet people at the worst day of their life, that day where they have or may die. I've met hundreds of patients who have had a cardiac arrest, were resuscitated and lived. And I've long thought, way before this book, way before writing at all, that these are the people that we should be listening to. Not the influencers or the billionaire business gurus in life on Instagram. These are the people who know what really matters. And it kind of struck me, these are the people who've seen both sides, people who've glimpsed darkness before returning to a new life. And I think they've got a huge amount to teach, not just healthcare providers and doctors, but members of the public about what's really important in life.
Yeah, that's powerful because I think, like you said, that from a seminal event like that, the circuit breaker that occurs both cognitively, physically, and emotionally, actually, to themselves and the family, is the most powerful reframer. And like you said, Matt, you've met hundreds of post-cardiac arrest survivors, like Ed, struck by lightning and saved by CPR. Could I get you to speak to why these individuals offer more wisdom about life than any other person, really? Like you say, any influencer or business guru?
Yeah, I think it's because, it's the ultimate reality check, really, isn't it? And I think it was Steve Jobs who said that death is life's greatest invention. It's the thing that really solidifies what matters and what doesn't matter. And the benefit about these people, and the book tracks 10 people, all of which who have had cardiac arrest from different causes. You've mentioned Ed struck by lightning. There was Summer who tried to take her own life. There was Rick who had an arrhythmia, for example, a heart issue. Um, there's Jen who needed a heart transplant, that her mum died of the very same operation. Her mum died after having a heart transplant. And I think what that really does is, as I say, solidify that what's important in life. But I think it doesn't have to be that to come to that realization. And part of the point of writing the book and talking to you and your listeners is to say, look, you don't have to go through that to make radical change. There are other ways to do it without needing to die. There's a quote I like which says, "We all have two lives. It's just the second begins when you realize you have one." And for different people in the world, they realize that through lots of means, whether it's nearly stepping out in front of a truck and having that, heart-stopping moment, or whether it's having a child or having somebody close to you die, for example. You don't have to go through something so extreme, but the people who have been through something so extreme, that's the ultimate kind of reality check.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And as you catalogue in the book, there's these 10 patients and others that have had this second chance from various aspects. And I guess in a way, my next question would be really what they teach us about life before death and before sort of we reach that point. I've been tracking some of your work, and something I found really fascinating was you having a funeral party, which, or a life party, really, which, celebrates everything. And I find this quite powerful. Everything that you value in life, the music, maybe a meal, maybe a location, and actually certain attributes which you can celebrate, and you almost don't need the seminal event of death for others to celebrate without you. Could I get you to speak to just some of these key attributes you can actually start to embody before death?
Yeah, spot on. So you're right. I held what's known as a living funeral towards the end of the book, and I'll get to why I did that and what that is. But writing a book is and doing a podcast is a bit like solving a puzzle that only you can solve. And it kind of got to the point that I'd met these 10 patients, about half of which I'd cared for myself. All of them brought, a lot of messages, but maybe each of them brought one kind of big story and one big suggestion for life with them. For example, Ed, who was struck by lightning, maybe taught us about the spotlight effect, how we all think that everyone's looking at us and caring about us. But actually, much of the time, people don't care. And that's not in a bad way. That's in a good way. You can wear that t-shirt that says something strange in it, or you can not comb your hair and go out that day. No one actually cares. It's this big phenomenon in psychology known as the spotlight effect. And then others, Mike, who was a fisherman who drowned, showing us that we're actually surrounded by strangers who want to help us all the time. Cody, who was a mine worker, showed us that the things that matter most in life are not things at all. So for me, each of these 10 people brought kind of a message for life, if you like. And I'd finished the draft of the book, and there was kind of a so what at the end. There was something missing. There was something missing for me to empathize in reality with these people, and I didn't know what it was. And it was a way of trying to get closer to what they'd experienced. In other words, kind of almost death. And then I started reading a lot about living funerals. And this is something which has happened for years and years. The Greeks did it. They had the Euclidean mysteries where they went into a cave, maybe took some drugs, maybe used lighting, talked about their future and their past, and were reborn. There was a famous Japanese film star who had a live-in funeral when there was actually nothing wrong with her. And most notably, recently, there are people with palliative diseases and terminal cancer, for example, who've had living funerals. So I thought, what better way to empathize with these people than my own death? Um, so I wrote an email to the local vicar and said, I'd love to have a funeral. And they wrote back and said, yep, that's fine, but normally you need to be Christian and dead, which was a bit awkward because I was neither. So, in fact, we held a group service instead, which was a lot better. It's not just about the individual. Six of my friends went away to the foothills of the Pyrenees. We had this old cottage, and we tried to put into place each of these 10 lessons. So, we had our favourite music. Our loved ones wrote our eulogies, my wife, my parents, my kids wrote my eulogy. We had a favourite reading, our favourite food, and we followed the lessons of the 10 people in the book. And I must say, it sounds strange, it was one of the best days of my life. And the takeaway line is really, I think everybody should have a funeral before they die.
Yes, and that's powerful. I can completely agree with you, actually. And I think there's real power to celebration and being part of that celebration, but also you're right, celebrating everything that life represents for you in your individual preferences. And yeah, that's super powerful. Just flipping it on its head, Matt, actually, and looking at the responsibility and indeed power of resuscitation for pre-hospital professionals. Something this book really as a powerful reframer is that, like you said already, life, you don't need a second chance at life to start living. And I think that alone is just an amazing takeaway. Could I get you to speak to really I guess the importance, we all go to work, and I think we spoke offline, you and me, over the horizon of 20 years, you can almost sometimes it be clouded. The reason why you joined work in the first place, the reason why you show up, the reason why you resuscitate patients, it can all migrate into the distance because you get lost in the minutiae of day to day and in the grind. But could I get you to speak to really the power and responsibility of really performing resuscitation for that one, even just for that 1%, how important it is that you show up, because I think these 10 examples giving life back to these 10 individuals to really celebrate life just places the vital importance for paramedics and pre-spot teams on that effort, that giving that gift of life. Again, you don't need the excuse for that to really live life, but I think people lose the horizon of how important it is to give people that chance. Could I get you to speak to that?
Yeah, one of the things I love about caring for people with an out of hospital cardiac arrest and who have survived resuscitation is it's still such a magical thing when you think about it. Somebody is effectively dead, and you do something physical, something that's actually very simple and very old. Yes, guidelines have evolved, but effectively you're still just pressing on the chest hard. That's kind of what we're doing. And that can give people the chance to live. Now, it doesn't cure the underlying problem. It's all about getting people to hospital alive so the problem can be fixed. But still, for me, I find it completely wild, and we kind of forget how wild that is, I think, actually. And the other beautiful thing about it is one of one of my heroes, I guess, is an Iron Bevan who's started the NHS. He's from Wales. He's from a town not too far from here, and I was involved in the play written by a friend of mine, Tim Price, all about his life called Nye. And one of the things he said is the purpose of power is to give it away. I think for me, surrounded in the intensive care unit by machines worth tens of thousands of pounds and staff and multidisciplinary teams and drugs and technology, all that's amazing. But actually, the way that you can get to hospital alive or not dead is thanks to you guys, thanks to the public, thanks to pre-hospital care providers and paramedics. And so, we can have as much fancy machines as we want in ICU, but if that first initial step isn't done well, quickly and properly, then when we can't get there. The other thing I like, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear on this podcast. Please bleep it out if I'm not. But you take somebody who is so ill, and yet I can then meet them in follow-up clinic 6 weeks later. And it reminds me of there's a Nepalese climber who did this incredible 14 peaks climb, a guy called Nimral. And he's got a quote I often think about, but don't say out loud when I meet these people, which is sometimes you feel like you were fucked. But when you say you were actually fucked, you're only like about 45% fucked. And for me, that says a lot about caring for critically ill people. You know, you think, surely not. I remember caring for a judge who had a cardiac arrest in the middle of court. He had about 20 cardiac arrests. He had VF storm. It was all tricky and terrible. And then a year or two later, I was at his retirement do. You know, in the court, he went back to work. He became a granddad. And for me, that flip, there's nothing bigger than that flip than caring for people after a cardiac arrest.
So one of the most powerful aspects, and that this book reflects actually, and you've just reflected it there, is, and we've seen the shift, the the moral and psychological zeitgeist has shifted slightly in a really good way. That a lot of HEMS services and a lot of pre-hospital ambulance services have got patient consultation and patient follow-up services, and there's a nurse or indeed a paramedic that goes and actually just involves the patient in that survivorship, but brings them back to the crew and actually, the deep psychological benefit of seeing the fruition of that, and indeed, but it's bilateral. It actually helps the patient play piece together their story, but also helps the crew in their sort of psychological reparation, and indeed how important the role is. Could I get you to speak to, just because there is still a long way to go, Matt? I think still a lot of services that don't necessarily integrate voice of the patient or indeed voice of the survivor and the extended families. But there is a significant now and a growing appetite for this within HEM services, that, patients are an integral part of the service and their narrative. Could I get you to speak to just the importance of really, I guess, embedding it on a national scale, just as a standard of care, that becomes part of, really, a fundamental part of the feedback mechanism?
Yeah, I'm really passionate about this, and I came to it in an odd way in many ways. You know, I spent about a decade of my life involved in quite hardcore research, including a PhD in immunology and then cardiac arrest research through TTM1 and TTM2, the big cardiac arrest trials. And most of that was all about survival, as you say. But I've never met a patient or a dad or a daughter or a husband or a wife who've said, what I really want for the person I love is to survive 90 days. They've never said that. And that's the end point in most of the significant trials. Now, I'm not criticizing the trials because you have to be alive to know what's important in life. But I think for me, the opposite of burnout isn't a yoga ball and a well-being class, and it's the opposite of burnout. It's burn in. And the way I burn myself in, if you like, is trying to follow up those stories, try to get humanity back. And this didn't start with work, actually, although I'm now involved in follow-up clinic where I work in Cardiff. It actually started with my first book, Critical, which was published back in 2018, 2019. And it's a non-fiction book about intensive care, really. When medical memoirs exploded, this was one about intensive care. And to start that book, I wanted to do kind of the ultimate follow-up. I wanted to find out who was the world's first intensive care patient. And I tracked down this little girl called Vivi, who had polio in 1952. I tracked down her existing family, Sven, her cousin. I went out to Copenhagen. I met them. I saw some amazing photos of Vivi and the fact that she survived into her 20s. She fell in love. She had a dog called Bobby. She had a little summer house she used to go to, even though she needed a ventilator for the rest of her life. She had a portable ventilator because of the effects of polio. So that was kind of the first deep follow up I kind of did, if you like, of the world's first intensive care patient. And then I did the same for the patient that made me want to do intensive care. And we've all got that collection of people that sometimes are called those we carry. The kind of patients that in a talk or in a lecture, or if you're having a stressful time at night, you can kind of see their faces, you remember their names, you remember everything about them. And I don't know why it's those group of patients, but I've got a group of those patients. But the one of which at the front is a guy called Chris, who was a student who went to Kenya on a gap year and developed severe necrotizing pneumonia. Came back to Cardiff 6 weeks later on a ventilator, critically ill, and sadly died just a few days after his 18th birthday party. And it was the questions that Chris's parents asked in that Breaking Bad News session that really resonated with me. They asked, why him? Why did Chris die and others live? And he died of sepsis and severe infection. What else could we do to help him and to help others? And the third question they asked was, what do we do now? They had a carrier bag full of Chris's clothes and his birthday candles, and, what do we do now? We're completely lost. And those three questions drove a lot of things in my life. They drove me to choose intensive care as a career. They chose me to do research into infection and sepsis. And latterly, they chose me to kind of, well, write the book explaining what it is to people, and also to support a bereavement charity so that people know what to do next. And the reason I tell you that story is because one of the hardest things I've ever done in my medical career was knock on the door to Chris's family a decade after he died, because I went to see them in their home and talk to them and ask them, could I write about Chris in my book? And so for me, that kind of follow up, even even when people have died, not necessarily when people have lived, is so important. And it's the opposite of burn-in. It's the opposite of burnout. I think it burns you in. How do you functionalize that in a system? Well, in intensive care, we have follow-up clinic, so we meet people weeks and months after they've survived. In terms of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, there are no services, as you said, pre-hospital services. Some run by a chap in England called Tom Keeble, who's doing amazing work in this area, who are giving cards, for example, not only to the families for follow-up services, but to the people who provided CPR, because that's a hugely distressing event for some people, and perhaps they need follow-up too. So yeah, I think it's critically important and something we need to get a lot better at.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. And we're actually going to do a three-part series on bereavement, actually, because to your point, actually, Matt, I don't think, and certainly I'm included in this in this comment, is we're well enough versed and or well enough educated and equipped with signposting towards bereavement. And I think I actually know through experiencing bereavement in my own life from my sister-in-law dying at 27 from
Ah,
cardiac myopathy, just that actually how to do bereavement well, but also how to signpost it and actually maybe well go on that journey actually
yeah.
and how that looks. So I think we're really going to explore it better both for
Mm,
clinicians, but to your point around personally, because I think it will
mm.
eventually touch all of our lives. And I think it has to be a something which we engage with or it engages with us, so you either engage with it ahead of time or it will engage you anyway.
Well, just to very briefly chime in on that, and thank you for telling us and sharing that. In this book, I learnt a lot about bereavement actually, and you would have thought, being an ICU doctor, I know about it, but the book includes what my youngest daughter's best friend sadly, her mum died some years ago, a few years ago, of cancer. And my daughter and her became friendly recently, and she used to come to our house, and we would kind of do all we could in a way to, avoid the topic and avoid talking about her mum. One day she was with us on Mother's Day. She was in our house sleeping over, and we kind of avoided that topic. And yet, my daughter's friend knew better than us, effectively, and she wanted to talk about her mum. She wanted to talk about her mum more than anything, especially on Mother's Day. And so now I've kind of completely flipped that. There's a saying that I said at the beginning, you have two lives. Well, you also have two deaths. And I think you die when your body dies, and you also die when people stop saying your name. And so, what I do now, when people, like you've just done, have said somebody close to me has died, I'll say, wow, that's sorry to hear that. But then I'll say, tell me about them. What was their name? And actually, sometimes walking towards that is important. So, yeah, thanks for telling us about your sister-in-law. What was her name?
Yeah, so her name was Catherine, Catherine Walker, and to your very point, actually, having to walk through bereavement with my brother, hand in hand, really. Some of the bereavement counsellors, and it was really beneficial. So we would make an effort to speak about Catherine
Mm,
for about an hour a day
mm,
initially,
mm,
and then maybe slightly less frequently, but in the passing years. But yeah, an hour a day we would
mm,
go to see her grave. But to your point about engaging with it, and also, just the good times and the bad times, the times which they struggled, and everything in between. But actually, to your point, not avoiding the subject, and actually appreciation that actually it's such a big part of someone's life, and our person is fundamentally. And even now, my brother's remarried,
mm,
has kids, but actually, even now, we still speak about Catherine,
mm,
and Ronan, my brother, is still in touch with Catherine's parents.
mm,
And actually it's an absolute tonic for them to
mm,
speak still about their daughter. And so there is this acknowledgement, and the revelation is that to exactly to your point, it's not shying away from that. And that's just one of the key facets, actually. And even again, to your point, even for pre-hospital providers, if there is any longevity of relationship there with survivors, it's, and again, as patient consultation and voice of the patient, and just the if there is an adverse outcome,
mm.
and there's not, it's not beneficial, even engaging with that family, and
Yeah.
talking with the family, and actually the family probably really want to know. And even if there's stuff not known to the clinician, just asking questions,
Mm,
what was their favorite food, and some of the what was some of the memories you guys have, what were some of the,
mm,
where did you work, and what kind of things would you enjoy doing together, and actually eliciting open questions where they get chance just to unpack more of the character. Now, again, that is personal,
mm,
but which is probably a preference they want to talk about, and it's hard maybe for a clinician to come on that journey because it humanizes a
mm,
patient, but actually it's an absolute tonic to the family. And actually, it was vital for my brother's rehabilitation that he engaged with that, and so it's giving credence to that, as you were
mm,
saying.
Thank you.
Just as we move on, Matt, just looking at something you've really notioned towards already, which is, you know, it's the emotional cost of being in the fog between life and death. And actually, there's a lot of empirical studies around the adage of PTSD for patients, where they can sometimes remember being on a ventilator. They can certainly remember their rehabilitation journey, and how stressful and traumatic that event was. But also, we've just spoken about the humanity, and engaging with that humanity with survivors and with clinicians alike. But how do you engage with families and indeed maybe engage with survivors around that humanity, just acknowledging the trauma that they've just been through. It might be a 2 or 3 month convalescence or rehabilitation phase where they've had a significant period of ventilation and damage control surgery. How do you maybe just kick that off and start engaging in that with that humanity and really bringing that narrative out in patients?
So we are lucky in Cardiff in that we have a follow-up clinic. So we see people in those phases after recovery and talk about the important things, which, you know, isn't all about subglottic stenosis and the medical things. Often it's about things like, hair loss, skin changes, libido changes, personality changes, financial challenges. It's about all of those things often. We also have a fantastic psychology team based in the intensive care unit. So I think those things together help. In terms of thoughts and tips for people listening, I have got one technique which I've been using for many years, which I find really helpful to tease out the person from the disease, especially in time pressured moments. I'd been doing this for years, and then one of the psychologists actually in Cardiff was in on a family conversation with me. And at the end, they said, "Oh, I love the way you use the empty chair technique." And I said, I'm sorry, what's that?" And it's a well described technique in psychology, actually. And what it consists of, very simply, is often towards the end of a conversation. Let's say somebody's had an out of hospital cardiac arrest. I've explained what's happened. I've explained the uncertainty. So I'll say the words "I don't know," for example, which are the three most important words in medicine. I think "I don't know," and we don't say them enough. I've said phrases that I've borrowed from other writers, like Catherine Mannix, who's an amazing palliative care physician. I've said phrases like "they're sick enough to die." That's a personal favorite phrase of mine. It contains hope, yet it contains the D word, die, that often needs to be said. But then I'll often point to an empty chair in the room, if there is one in the NHS, and I'll say, if your dad, mum, brother, sister was sitting with us here now, listening how ill they are and that they are sick enough to die from this, what would they say? And that often elicits strange things. Sometimes people will crack a joke. They'll say, "Oh, he would have said, just leave me alone, I'll be fine," or it'll often elicit things like, "Oh, they'll say, I wouldn't want this. I wouldn't want to be kept alive by all these machines." It often gives people the permission to speak on behalf of somebody else when, as a wife or a mum or a husband, you wouldn't be able to say those things. But when you're speaking through somebody, you can. So yeah, that's a technique that I really like, actually, and I think is very effective.
Yeah, it's a powerful reframer, actually. Absolutely, absolutely. So just coming to land slightly, Matt, a couple of more questions. One really would be around sort of the cultural reflections really on mortality. And I guess because the cultural piece is extremely important because, I've heard you speak on this before around there is people and different cultures process death and life differently and they have different approaches to funerals, both and to afterlives. And there's a really wide spectrum. But could I get you to speak to really how you, from your anecdotal observation, how people interpret near-death experiences from a cultural piece, and indeed how, I guess, in a way, appreciation of that might help support them in recovery?
Yeah, and actually, this book and the talk and my passion and interest in cardiac arrest and other things, often that isn't about death, it's about life. But we live our lives forward, regardless of culture and religion and other things. We live forwards, but I think sometimes life is best understood backwards. And so that's kind of why I've begun, not at the beginning, but at the end. And I think regardless of culture and religion, that making sense of a story by framing it like that is helpful. And ultimately, the cause of death is life. That's the price we pay. In terms of those experiences, actually, so I haven't written in the book at all about afterlife. I haven't written about that. I think, there's probably not a chance to get an afterlife crisis, so why not have a life crisis instead? But what I have written a book about and thought about are those near-death experiences, as you mentioned. I wasn't going to, if I'm honest, originally. I'm a scientist. I like data and science and all of those things. But actually, after meeting those 10 people, over half of them described something very similar. They all described, some version of seeing something, whether it was a light or people, hearing things, having a sense that there was someone there, and being present. And so I looked into this in a lot of detail, and I came across a fascinating study where there was an elderly patient with a terminal disease, with terminal cancer, who was involved in a research project for completely other reasons. They were having some EEGs done and having, I think, a functional MRI scan done, and they happened to die during those tests. They weren't resuscitated because they'd had a do not resuscitate order in place. They had a terminal disease. But the scientists, after they died, looked back at these studies that were being done through that transition between life and death. And what was amazing is all the bits of the brain that lit up were the bits related to seeing light, having a photo recall of memories, having the feeling that there was somebody there, kind of presence, bits related to auditory sensations. And so I think it's probably true that as you die, you see a white light, your life flashes before your eyes, and you're not alone. And, I don't know why that is. It's probably the process of neuronal brain death, but there might be other explanations. And regardless of the reason, I'm glad that's the case.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And Matt, as we've just come into land, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege actually just to walk through your book with you. And I think what we'll do in the show notes is we'll signpost to the second act, because it's fantastic. It's a fantastic read, and indeed I would recommend listeners go away and indeed read it. But just finally, Matt, you have met hundreds of people who've died and lived again, and indeed. There is a responsibility, as you said, to share their messages. Could I get you to speak to, in a way, maybe some of the most prescient or just common themes, or just one or two, maybe even three things that you could share with paramedics or indeed pre-hospital staff, just to keep front of mind, really, when it when attending, just showing up for work, and just to instill the importance of this work for people.
Yeah, I guess one thing we haven't spoken about, which was a real life lesson for me, was a story from Reese, who was an international rugby player, and he developed a severe heart condition, needing a transplant. Actually, he still needs a transplant. But during that time, he made lots of bad life choices. So he would wake up sometimes in police cells with his external pump keeping his heart going, his LVAD, with just a few minutes of battery life left. And that was because of bad choices he made with drinking too much and so on. And Reese's story is important not only for redemption, because Reese is now a transformed character. He runs coaching for youth people. He's involved in breath work. He's a motivational speaker. He's an incredible human. But also because I think it teaches us that you are not your worst mistake. And often in intensive care and in pre-hospital care, we meet people during their worst mistake. But the truth is, we've all made those mistakes. I look after people who have driven too fast and have hurt or killed people. I've met people who've drunk too much and done stupid things. And I've done those things. I've driven too fast. I've drunk too much. But I was lucky that I didn't end up hurting or killing someone or doing something stupid. And that's what the Oxford philosopher called moral luck. It's just luck, really, or bad luck that you're not that one. We've all done the same actions, but they've resulted in something different. So the story Reese tells us is the time to make up your mind about somebody is never. And I think that really helps when you're in those tough situations pre-hospitally, dealing with bad life choices, bad mistakes. Yeah, just remember that, you were not your worst mistake. And I guess the final thing to think about as well as that is that for me, life is an emergency. We think about getting to an emergency within 8 minutes, 6 minutes. Well, actually, our life is an emergency. It's so fleeting, and life and death are just 11 and 1 on clock faces. They're always there, they're always close together, and yet so they feel far apart. And that makes me appreciate life, actually. If I'm having a rubbish day, if I've got a flat tire or a tax bill, and I go into ICU and I see how close life and death are, it doesn't make the tax bill go away, it doesn't make the flat tire repair itself, but it makes me just care a little bit less about those things if I remember that life is an emergency.
Listen, that's a powerful reframer, and something we can all really benefit from on a daily basis. Actually, yeah, that's powerful. Matt, listen, thank you for the last 45 minutes. It's just a pleasure to walk through your book with you, but also your experiences and your reflection on those experiences. We will put a link to the book in the show notes. But listen, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.